Okay, today I'm going to talk about government economic policy, but first of all, we're going to look at the macro policy objectives. Generally, all governments look for three objectives: price stability, low unemployment, and economic growth. Obviously, some governments have certain philosophies like more equality, or maybe a greener government wants less pollution, etc. But these are universal objectives for an economy for good reason. For example, price stability. You need price stability to really progress, to keep an economy growing and make it less prone to crisis. You can't have maybe unpredictable prices or prices that change all the time, or very high inflation, etc. People need, and organisations need, to invest in projects that take years, and they don't want the risk coming from the possibility of the economy collapsing instead of, on top of the risk, shall we say, on top of the risk of the project not succeeding. So that's quite important. Low unemployment is very important. Again, this is an obvious objective because this is how people feel the pain of an economy that's not working very well. People need work to keep going forwards, to buy houses, to maintain a family, etc. And then economic growth is again very important. We need to progress so we can build an economy that is something better for our children. Maybe they will have more medical developments, or more time to spend with their kids, or a green economy. That's a very important objective, and it all needs economic growth to get there. So these three objectives, economic objectives, are key for the policy that any government develops. Now, one type of policy is a fiscal policy. This is the use of taxation and government spending to influence aggregate demand. So it's a demand side policy. Aggregate demand, let's remember, is all the demand in the economy. Now, if we change aggregate demand, if we increase it, maybe we can increase employment if there is spare capacity, or maybe reduce inflation. And that can be done through taxation and spending, government spending. We've got to remember the government operates a very big part of the economy. 40% maybe is the level of taxation and government spending in the economy. So they have a lot of power to accelerate the economic activity, or de-accelerate if it's necessary. So that's what fiscal policy is. Now, it can be applied through the budget, the fiscal policy, and this is the yearly statement of what the government will tax and spend. So that's all their intentions. Maybe they will increase income tax, or increase education spending, or whatever. And maybe if they want an expansionary fiscal policy, they want to accelerate the economy, they could have a budget deficit. And that's when government spending exceeds tax revenue. So obviously they will be pumping more into the economy, more aggregate demand. Or alternatively, they may want to slow the economy down. It's overheating. They say, economists often say, it's overheating when it's really peaking. All the resources are being used, and inflation's going up, so they have a budget surplus where tax revenue exceeds government spending. And a balanced budget is when tax equals spending. So there could be, if we have a low economic growth and the government aim to change this, this might happen naturally with what's called automatic stabilizers, because by increasing unemployment, they'll have to pay more unemployment benefits, and there will be a reduction in tax because there'll be less people working. So actually this should increase the speed of the economy, the economic activity. So this is an automatic stabilizer, and maybe there's not a budget deficit is not necessary. That's a judgment that the government would have to make. A budget deficit which occurs due to a fall in economic activity. Obviously, if there's a fall in economic activity, people are paying much less tax, and that's called a cyclical deficit. So it's not intended by the government, and it's just something which has happened because the economy is slowing. That's a cyclical deficit. A structural deficit is when the government is committed to too much spending relative to its tax revenue. So if the government's plans are very ambitious and they want to build, I don't know, Trump always wanted to build a wall in America, and that cost a lot of money, and he was very expensive. That might be a structural deficit, and this can be more worrying than a cyclical deficit, because with a cyclical deficit, maybe the GDP comes up as it goes through its natural cycle, and it rights itself. The deficit disappears. Whereas with a structural deficit, the governments might be just using electoral reasons, might be just trying to be popular. Now, if there is a deficit, we will need to borrow money, and that means that will increase the national debt. The national debt is all the money borrowed by the public sector. So it's not just central government. It could be regions, it could be even public industry, hospitals or public education. Any debt that is built up by the public sector is the national debt. It's usually expressed as a percentage of GDP, because that's it's very important to see it through the perspective of the GDP. If you've got a very big GDP, you can serve a very big debt. If your GDP is very small, you won't be able to have such a big debt. So normally it's expressed as a percentage, and then you can compare with countries or with different periods. Often, the national debt increases during a downturn because the government's getting less tax, so they'll have to borrow money to stop any social problems. Maybe they'll need more money to put into the economy to get economic activity moving again, and so often they'll do this through national debt. Remember, the national debt mainly is bonds, government bonds sold by the central bank to individuals, savers, or industry or banks, foreigners, whoever. They have these big sales, maybe 50 billion of bonds every so often needs to be sold to borrow money to cover any deficits in the government budget. But if the GDP does go up, then obviously the national debt ratio to GDP goes down. That's one way of solving the problem, is to increase the GDP, and then the debt won't be such a big problem. Now, what are the disadvantages to a large national debt? One disadvantage is the opportunity costs to the payment of interest. Sometimes we have to pay billions, like 50 billion in interest, and that 50 billion could be paid to build hospitals or more schools or upgrading, roads to motorways or whatever. So that is an opportunity cost for the country. Maybe even could be paid to pensioners, to increase the standard of living. So that's quite a considerable cost. But also, if the debt gets so large, the lenders will be less convinced about buying the bonds, and so will need to be offered higher interest. So the more likely a government looks as a default on the loan, the higher the interest they'll have to offer. So, if they absolutely need to borrow 50 billion and they can't get enough people to buy 50 billion's worth of bonds, they'll have to increase the interest rate. And this, can be very dangerous. We've seen some countries like Spain in 2007, the interest rate rose and rose and rose and nearly brought them to default. We look at some interest rates like Germany, which is very low because lenders are confident about lending Germany, and then Italy's is higher because they're not so confident, and that does mean there's this spread. That means the German model will be much more competitive because everything they do will be cheaper, whether it's building a road or educating people. We always have to pay a bit more in interest to get any finance. So that's a big problem if we lose confidence of the markets. So looking at the taxation side of the fiscal policy, there's two types of taxes. You've got indirect taxes on products or services, and these are all taxes on spending. So anything that is sold in the shops or on any market, normally you have to pay a tax, and that's taxes collected by the business, which passes it on to the government, and for that reason it's called indirect taxes. The two main indirect taxes are value added tax, VAT, which is like the Italian IVA, and is a percentage of the price. I think it's about 22% now of the price of any product or service is the VAT or IVA. And then you've got specific taxes, which are taxed on the quantity sold. So every cigarette packet will be a certain amount of tax, or every litre of petrol will be a certain amount of tax. And these indirect taxes on particular products can be called excise duties. So they can also be known as excise duties. We get them on alcohol, cigarettes, petrol, normally on things that we think are not such a good contribution to our economy. Like cigarettes harm people, so maybe they can't work so much, they lose days of work, etc. So we want to deter them, so we put a heavy tax, an excise duty on there. The other category is direct taxes. These are on income and wealth. So these are paid directly to the government on our income or on our wealth. Wealth being, maybe our house or shares or something. Income could be on our wages that we get from work. Advantages of direct taxes. Normally they have a high revenue yield. This means that the government can get a lot of money from direct taxes. If we can think about indirect taxes, by putting taxes on, this might deter people from buying. So it actually might go down in yield by putting indirect taxes. It depends on its elasticity of demand, obviously. But normally people don't stop working if they have to pay higher taxes. They can also reduce inequalities in income and wealth. So, obviously if the government is more orientated towards an equal society, they can increase direct taxes, and that will really reduce our differences. Often we pay 40%, let's say up to €50,000, and for example after that you go into another bracket, so maybe you pay 50% after €50,000, etc. So they can really target direct taxes at reducing inequalities. And they are based on ability to pay, so that is an advantage, isn't it? Those that are stronger will pay more, which is fair. A disadvantage is they reduce work incentives. So, people will, if their tax goes up, they'll still work, but maybe they won't do the overtime, or maybe they won't work at weekends, or accept, a second job, etc. Because it might move them into another tax bracket, or they might not see the gain that that extra bit of work deserves. If they're already tired, they might be convinced if they could get the same rate, but if it goes up, or the rate of pay goes down because of the tax, then that will put them off. It reduces enterprise incentives. Many businesses get fiscal benefits by being small, having less than 15 workers or something. If they go over that, they maybe move into another bracket of tax and less protection, and maybe they won't want to grow. So the enterprise incentives will be reduced. And also there will be tax evasion. So if you've got direct taxes, you're going to get tax evasion. If they go up, you'll get more tax evasion. The higher they are, the more beneficial it is not to declare the tax. And at some point it becomes a little bit legitimate if everyone's doing it. If you've got private lessons or maybe decorating, often people don't pay tax, and it becomes accepted and doesn't look so illegitimate because the taxes are so high. The lower the taxes, maybe the more unacceptable it would be. Advantages of indirect taxes: they are cost effective. Remember, the businesses are collecting this tax and processing it, doing the administration for it, etc. So the government don't have to make such a big investment into the administrative side. They'll expand the tax base. So young children are paying this tax because it's on goods and services, or maybe pensioners or the unemployed. So everybody's paying this tax. It's not just those working or those producing. They could be used to target specific products and activities, like I said before, cigarettes or alcohol. And they're very flexible. So it's quite easy for the government to change them. Whereas when we're talking about income tax, it becomes a complicated calculation. A lot of paperwork needs to be done to calculate how much somebody owes in income tax. Changing it from 22% to 23% would be much easier for indirect taxes. Disadvantages, they're inflationary, they push up the prices obviously. They are regressive because they hurt the poorer more, because the poorer tend to spend more of a bigger proportion of their income. They have a less disposable income, and the rich tend not to. A 10% VAT on a book would be nothing to somebody rich, but quite a lot to somebody poor. So they are regressive. They do hurt the poor more than the rich. Revenues are less certain and predictable. Again, we don't necessarily know whether an increase in this tax would actually slow demand and so reduce the revenue, or whether the revenue will go up. It all depends on elasticity of demand, etc., and the consumer behaviours. Whereas a direct tax, people continue to work even if the tax goes up, so they're more predictable and certain. Again, they can encourage tax evasion. Indirect taxes, if they're very high, for example, if you find cigarettes are much cheaper in England, maybe some people will bring cigarettes from England and sell them on the black market to evade the tax. And I find a lot of people interested in buying those black market products. There can be three different tax systems. You've got progressive tax system, and this is where the proportion of tax rises as income increases. An example of this is income tax. So maybe you pay 40% for the first 50,000. After that, you will pay maybe 50%. Maybe after 70,000, you start paying 80% tax. Okay, so it hurts the rich. It's very distribution. It distributes the wealth or the income very well. Regressive is where the proportion of tax falls as income rises, and we find, indirect tax is quite regressive. The proportion of the poor person's indirect taxes are a lot higher than the rich, especially with products like cigarettes, because poor people smoke proportionally more than rich people, so that would be a very regressive tax. Proportional tax takes the same proportion of income, whatever the level of income, sometimes called a flat tax, where it's exactly the same throughout the earnings, the income. The marginal rate of taxation means the proportion of extra income taken in tax. So if I earn $100 more, how much tax would be on that? So that's very important, because will it be encouraging people to work more or less? Whereas the average rate of taxation is the proportion of a person's income that is taken in tax. So it's not the extra, it's just the average. Reasons for taxation. So obviously it's to raise revenue for government spending on merit goods like education, health, but also we can see it as a means of influencing aggregate demands. Maybe the government wants to tax to increase or decrease aggregate demand, or reduce to increase it. To redistribute income. So maybe a government has a more egalitarian philosophy, so it chooses taxes as a way of redistributing the income. To discourage consumption of demerit goods is a good reason to tax. Again, cigarettes is a good example. Or to discourage consumption on imports. Trump did this a lot to China. He didn't like the trade deficit America had with China, so he put tariffs, he put a tax on imports from China. So that's another reason.